Welcome, everybody, to the 34th episode, I believe, of the ABT Time podcast. And I am here with my ABT Time mug, as always. We got a great episode for you today. It's been, I think, a few weeks since we've done an episode. We had a very busy month of February, running 4 concurrent rounds of the course, 2 with National Park Service, 1 with Cornell, 1 with East Carolina University, and then with the Pfizer global epidemiology team. So, and one of those was shared between NPS and Cornell. So we're finally winding down from that. But yeah, February went by like a blur, but really good. And the Pfizer folks have enjoyed it so much, gotten so much out of it, that we're actually starting to put together a 2.0 version with them for the first time ever with an organization, which is going to move from the training into the gym concept, which will be weekly workouts for who knows, for the rest of the time, maybe with a little luck. Okay, so today we're going to have a fascinating discussion here with old buddy of mine. Hard to believe. I've known this fellow for 24 years. Time blows by. I got out of film school at USC 1997, and shortly after, in that last year, I got invited to a science meeting. And for 3 years, I'd left the science world and gotten immersed in film school, and then was invited back to the science meeting. It was my first time going back to a science meeting in 3 years. And I sat there that day, sitting through these academic talks, thinking to myself, how in the world did I ever used to sit through these things? I'd been through 3 years in Hollywood and film school where the pacing was so fast, and my whole narrative part of my brain had gotten adjusted to a new speed. And there I was back in the slow lane of all these scientists giving their academic presentations. And so I came back and managed to talk some people in the biology department there into finding a few funds, and ended up putting together a video, like a 20-minute video called Talking Science, the Elusive Art of the Science Talk. And for that video, I interviewed a variety of faculty in cinema, first off, because I'd had some great professors there in the courses I'd taken in the film school. And then in a variety of other departments, in the theater department, several of science professors in different departments at USC, and then several professors, probably the biggest group of all, in the Annenberg School of Communication. I began actually talking with Marty Kaplan, who I think is maybe still the head of the Norman Lear Center there in the Annenberg School. He and I became good buddies and have stayed in touch over the years. He's the guy that guided me to Frank Daniel's kind of monumental speech in '86, where we start the whole ABT template out of that. And then introduced me to a variety of faculty members, and one of whom, who probably has the most memorable clip in the whole video, is Tom Hollihan, who's my guest here today. And actually, before I even bring him on, I'm going to begin here with this clip. Okay, so this is Tom Hollihan with a legendary, monumental, unforgettable 40-second soundbite. Here we go.
Some of the most effective theories about communication talk about the arousal and fulfillment of your audience's desires. You want to pique their interest, and then you want to satisfy that interest that you've piqued. And if you fail in either regard, you haven't had an effective message. If you don't arouse them, they never get engaged and never connect and never listen. If you don't fulfill them, they walk away saying, well, that wasn't a very satisfying talk.
Okay, on that note, Tom, can you join us here? Activate your microphone and camera.
Hi, Randy.
Good morning. How you doing?
I look the same.
Nothing's changed. You're Dorian Gray.
Exactly.
Timeless picture. Can you believe 24 years since that simple little interview? And of all the clips in that 20-minute video, that one has just really persisted. I've written about it a lot. You introduced me to this couplet of arouse and fulfill. You spoke it so perfectly and eloquently. Like every word in that little clip really was just right on the money. And so lots of people use it. We posted this thing on YouTube, maybe probably 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. It's got 11,000 views on there, and we've never really done anything to promote it, but that's 11,000 scientists that I think have seen it. It gets used in a lot of different classes, and it's really a time capsule now, 24 years later. Some of the other bits in there are really great as well. How's it been in the 24 years since then? Everything wonderful at the Annenberg School?
Well, everything continues to be good. I've been busy, trying to coach effective communication strategies, both to my campus students and to people in the community. I've worked with a lot of military and NGO leaders And so it's been an interesting ride.
I noticed your textbook there that you've got an argumentation with a co-author, and you're in the fourth edition on that. Has that become really one of the classics and used in courses all around the place? I imagine.
Yeah, I think it's one of the top two or three argumentation textbooks. The new edition is coming out in a month, and we've really updated it with a lot of new examples. Of course, the whole focus on disinformation and misinformation is a new phenomena. So the book includes a lot of sections now on how to recognize and how to refute, misinformation.
Tell me about the arouse and fulfill couplet that's in that little soundbite, because when you told me about it that day in 1998, you we didn't get it in the video, but you said, there's basically a century's worth of theoretical work in the world of communications around that simple little couplet. Can you fill us in a bit on that?
Well, the theory is really not mine originally by any means, and I would never claim it as such. You can find its origins in lots of places. One of the people who wrote about this notion is Kenneth Burke. And what Kenneth Burke said is that people have expectations that are dictated by a sense of form. And so when we go to a graduation speech, we expect the speaker to have a certain kind of message and style. And so that expectation is going to color how we're going to listen to the remarks. And if the expectation is violated, we're not going to find the speech successful. And so part of that could be a genre that speaks to us. Part of it could be that we listen to solve the interests and problems that most concern us personally. So if I've got elderly parents, which I do, I'm really focused on what may happen to Medicare in budget cuts or budget considerations. If I've got young children, and I don't, but I've got a young grandchild, I'm going to be really focused on what's happening in elementary schools. If I live in an inner city, I may be anxious about crime. If I'm a farmer, I worry about seed corn prices. So we acutely listen to things that impact us individually. The problem with a lot of scientists is they begin their presentations by focusing on what interests them instead of what interests or likely concerns their audiences. And so that's really the starting point for that notion of arousal is think about your audience, think about their motivation, their problems, their concerns, and then try to structure your message around how your data, your science, your findings connect to their problems, their interests, their experience in reality.
Do you know the book They Say, I Say from Jerry Graff?
I know it, but I don't know it well. I mean, I've more heard of it than know it.
Yeah, interesting. He in 2005, he had an article in Harper's that was about the intelligent design movement, and I made a movie then called Flock of Dodos that was a documentary that ended up at Tribeca and aired on Showtime for a couple of years. That was about the attacks on evolution by the intelligent design movement. And I had read his article. And so I went to University of Illinois, Chicago on a cold and blustery winter day with my cameraman. We interviewed him in his office and he was great. We had a long talk. And that was actually before he'd even published They Say, I Say. He'd written a book called Teaching the Conflicts. And what had happened with him was that the intelligent design movement picked up on that and turned it into a slogan for their whole movement, which was teach the controversy. And they were trying to claim victimhood, basically, that they were being suppressed. They weren't allowed to teach this controversy. And the science world was saying there is no controversy. It's just nonsense what you guys are talking about. But Jerry and I got to be buddies from that. And then I lost track of him. And then in about 2012 or so, an undergraduate mentioned to me that she had this book, They Say, I Say, in I think 2 or 3 courses in the humanities. And then she mentioned the author's name, and I rang a bell like, wait a second, that's the guy that's in my documentary. So he and I got to be really good buddies. I've had lunch with him a couple of times in Chicago when I'm there visiting. The interesting thing is this 3-part structure that I've converged on of basically agreement, contradiction, and consequence that really can be tracked all the way back to Hegel and the triad and the philosophers in the 1700s. Have you spent much time working with that triad structure and thinking about that?
Not exactly with that structure, but with similar structures under the rubric of what we call deliberation studies, where you look at contention, disagreement, dissensus, and then an attempt to try to find a path back to agreement.
Okay, wait a second. Can you slow that way down? Because I'm a little bit dense on some of these things. So nice and slowly what you're saying there.
So you look at contention. So I make a claim and you make a counterclaim, and then that becomes the foundation for a disagreement. And our language system has a predisposition toward agreement. And so the natural tendency for people is to avoid the conflict unless they have a stake in it, right? And then you make a turn either toward agreement or toward intensifying or furthering, continuing the disagreement. And so it's conversation theory, essentially, that says this preference for agreement shapes most conversations. And we have to teach people how to productively disagree. And a lot of what gets taught urges people to come to agreement too quickly and silences dissent. It doesn't facilitate the surfacing of disagreements that may produce profitable new grounds for agreement, new ideas. And so productive disagreement is what public deliberation ought to be about. And that's not just saying that no, or it's not just resistance, but it's trying to find win-win solutions where both sides listen carefully and accept the better arguments that are offered by their alternatives. It also implies an acceptance that my claims can be falsified by your claims. In short, it's a respectful disagreement because I don't presume that I always have the right answer. I'm instead producing the sources of disagreement so that we can examine them and mutually try to find a path forward.
Yeah. What part of the country did you grow up in? Where'd you go undergraduate?
I grew up in Minnesota and graduated from the University of Minnesota with my bachelor's degree.
What year was that?
1974.
Okay. All right. And I graduated in 77. So we're similar vintage. What do you think about what we've lived through in terms of the information explosion that took place in the 80s? And for me personally, I feel like I entered into college in a world that no one talked about information overload or short attention spans, anything like that. And I bought into an academic field that I would get to be this distinguished professor, calmly going about my work and being respected by everybody. And I felt like by the early 80s, something was changing. And suddenly this information explosion thing began. And suddenly all the faculty where I was in graduate school just had no time at all. Suddenly they were saying, I'm booked, I'm swamped. I can't even talk to you. And professors that were hanging out with us couldn't find time to hang out with us anymore. The world just changed for me in the 1980s and never went back. And I kind of feel like the world has kind of been spinning just out of control ever since. You got any thoughts parallel to that and across the decades?
The invention of digital communication, of course, meant everything traveled quickly and there were no space limits for content. And so the compression of information was such that, articles could become more and more lengthy and they would reach you on a daily basis. People's media consumption habits meant that we tended to consult sources of media in all the moments when we had nothing else before us. So we're waiting for an elevator, we pull out our mobile phone and we're headline grazing for news, or we're going through our emails. There's no, for most people, turning that off, even at night, so you can go on vacation and you're still bringing your technology with you and still answering work emails. So I think that's part of it.
Yeah.
The second part of it is that nobody's exercising editorial judgment in the same way anymore. There used to be a common conversation where the editors of the key media would decide what people needed to know. And now people are judging that for themselves, or they're judging it on the basis of their networks. And so that's created an information avalanche, I would say.
And does that worry you?
Absolutely worries me because we don't have the new media literacy skills, I think, to help people make good decisions based upon the information that they're exposed to. There is no reason, for instance, that we had the kind of vaccine resistance to the COVID vaccines. It was a completely irrational sort of response because the media ecology was such that people stopped trusting experts. So even though they're accepting vaccinations for all kinds of other diseases, they were rejecting it for one that was killing, 6 million people around the world. And it demonstrates a kind of irrationality that I think is alarming.
Do you think story dynamics played a role in that?
I think story dynamics may have been part of it, but I think the big thing is echo chambers of media, that people who were on the right were listening to media sources that were in many cases profiting from misinformation. They were selling crank cures, and along with the crank cures, they were selling anti-government and anti-science messages that fed people's anxieties about elitist cultures and the like. So, I think there were several things responsible, but it clearly had consequence. 965,000 dead Americans that didn't have to die, I think, because of this misinformation.
Yeah. Let me take a shot at something that's a little bit parallel, but maybe a little different distance. But I'm sure in the science world, what I've written about in my Houston We Have a Narrative book in 2015 was that in the beginning, in the 1600s, the first published scientific papers were all non-narrative. They were just stream of information, stream of consciousness, tons of information. Here's this, here's that, here's this. By the 1800s, they began to take a little bit of a shape into a three-part structure, which was introducing a theory that's being thought about, introducing an experiment to put it to the test, and then having a discussion of where the results fit into that. By a century ago, in the 1920s, the science world came together and very thoughtfully, I think, laid out this convention, this structure for the writing of scientific papers that's now labeled as IMRAD, Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. That was first formalized in the 1920s. There's a paper that looked at the 4 top medical journals, the adoption of the IMRAD template. And for the 4 top medical journals, it took them 50 years from the first journals to use it a little bit were in the early 30s. Was until the mid 80s that all 4 of them had finally got to 100% applying that for all papers that are written. My feeling is that those people a century ago thought more clearly, had a better feel for communication, narrative structure, all these sorts of things. And today we've got a cacophony and everything's out of control. Do you agree with that, or do you think that we communicate better today?
Well, I think what you're describing is the foundational creation of disciplined knowledge, right? Academic disciplines were, in fact, ways that people mastered figuring out how to talk to each other. And the papers that you describe were largely read by other people inside the academy who shared the expertise. I think what's happened today is a kind of broadening of academic knowledge where people are writing for audiences, or at least imagining audiences that are more broadly conceived. And some of those audiences, for instance, may be those who fund the research, or they may be policymakers who you're trying to influence with the studies that you're writing, or they may be publics who you're trying to engage to modify or change their behavior in response to your research findings. And as you broaden the conception of audience, you have to find other ways to try to talk to them. And the conventions of storytelling begin to change. I would argue it's not like those early papers aren't telling a story. They're just telling a story within a very fixed notion of what the outlines of or demands of the story are. And they're very formulaic. But when you tell
which articles are you talking about?
The introduction, the method, the research questions, the conclusion, that is a narrative form.
Oh yeah.
It's just a very structured inside the laboratory sort of shared form. What happens when you find different audiences, you have to find different ways to engage your storytelling. And of course, that I think is part of what's being reflected in research findings today.
Yeah. Now, I had this discussion with you probably about 10 years ago, and we differed on this. I had asked you can you define the 2 words narrative versus story? And what would your answer be to that?
Well, I think narratives are made up of stories. And so, they're fundamentally knitted together in my usage of the term. And they're based upon experience, they're based upon culture, they're based upon your academic training, they're based upon your imagined future and your constructed notions of the past. And they come together, and the stories become the opportunities to showcase different elements of those in narrative form. Often they're experiential, or they're aspirational, and so I think all those things connect together. But I think in the language they become almost interchangeable.
Yeah, see, that's exactly what we hit on 10 years ago. And then that differs from the approach that I've taken, which is more analytical. And I've derived it from Joseph Campbell's monomyth model. And the way I define the word narrative is as the series of events that occur in the search for the solution to a problem. And so everything we do in the training nowadays that we do is all problem solution oriented. And the idea that the narrative part of a story is when you establish a problem and then you head off on a journey trying to solve it. So that's the more mechanistic definition that I've had. But when I get into the humanities, I find that most people there just don't like to tease them apart. They feel that a story is a narrative is a story. And that's what you had said to me 10 years ago.
And I think we're all solving our own problems, Randy. I mean, just getting through the day, for most of us, we're thinking about the problems, the obstacles, the anxieties, and the concerns, and looking for strategies to help us cope, help us respond, help us meet them. And so, in the midst of a global pandemic, we now get a war in Europe that we almost haven't seen in decades. And so we're living in an existential set of problems, actually.
Well, and that's a perfect segue into the second big chunk of stuff I wanted to talk to you about here, which is the pandemic and COVID communication. And I've gotten pretty deeply involved in that in the past 2 years. What happened to me was in October of 2020, that first year, Michael Osterholm, who's one of the top epidemiologists.
Minnesota.
Minnesota. Exactly. There you go. Your home state. And he was on Meet the Press. And he was the first prominent scientist I heard in the media world saying, we're doing a bad job with communication. We're failing on the messaging. And specifically what he said is we're failing to speak in a single voice. We've got people all over the place contradicting each other. And then he also said we're failing to tap into the power of story dynamics. So I heard that. I got in touch with him immediately through my friends at the CDC. And he and I, the next day, were on the phone, and the rest is history. We've spent a year and a half now working together on and off, working together very productively when we're not at each other's throats. And we've gotten into a number of heated arguments about the communication stuff, but then also agree on so much. And he's such a good guy. So I helped him write part of the script for his podcast for about 3 or 4 months. And through him, I've gotten a fair amount of insight because he was one of the first 13 members on Biden's advisory board that came in and began to help mastermind things once Biden came into office. So in November of 2020. And they, so let's see, jump forward to just a month and a half ago, I gave a talk at Scripps where Eric Topol is the vice president there at the Scripps Research Institute. And he really liked my talk and asked me to be on his podcast. Well, in December on his podcast, he had as a guest Andy Slavitt. And Andy Slavitt, was kind of the COVID czar at the start of the Biden administration. He was put in charge of pulling together this whole team of experts, which eventually grew from 13 to 16. And what they put together was eventually 2 different teams. The first one was the advisory board. That was dissolved when after the inauguration, and then got turned into the White House COVID response team, which was another team of about 15 or so individuals. And so on Eric Topol's podcast in December, he had Andy Slavitt on there. And at the end of the entire discussion, the last thing he said was, so how do you evaluate how good a job do you think you guys did? And here's what Andy Slavitt said. I think we'll look back and give ourselves an A or an A- in what I call the hard sciences. And I think we'll get a D- or an F in the social sciences. You got any thoughts on that for starters?
Well, I mean, where I would start is I would say in 2014, the Obama administration put together a commission to come up with a report planning for a future pandemic.
Right.
And the document they did, and there were a lot of communication scholars who were part of the team. The primary person involved was Matthew Seeger, who's the dean of communication at Wayne State. And the report they put together is one of the best I've ever seen. In fact, I use it as a model when I do work with the Navy on how to put together a strategic plan and a communication plan and blend them together for action. The problem was the Trump administration never went to the bookshelf and took that document off the shelf and said, what do we have in the event we face a pandemic? And they didn't do that because he didn't want a pandemic. He didn't want to get people all riled up. He didn't want to see the markets collapse. And it wasn't like he didn't know what was coming, or at least it wasn't like there weren't people in government who didn't know. Because I was an election observer for the Taiwan election in January of 2020. And we went to a briefing at the America Foundation, which is the equivalent of the embassy. We don't have an embassy there because we don't formally recognize Taiwan, but it's the equivalent. And we were given a briefing about this new disease emerging in Wuhan that was airborne. And that was January 11th or 12th of 2020. Mm-hmm. And parts of our government already knew what was coming, but that message was not coming out of the White House for sure. There was a refusal to speak truth. And there was an unwillingness to stand up to the president in a political culture that didn't tolerate that kind of disagreement. And so I think the assessment is right. But I think once we got to an administration that respected science, then the social science got better too. Now, has it been flawless? No.
Okay.
Including the message on masking that came out last week, I thought was a horrible mess.
Sure. But this is where now you and I will diametrically oppose each other. And I completely disagree with so much of what you just said, because that 2014 preparedness report, in my opinion, was disastrous. And it's all been disastrous, in my opinion, because this anti-science movement that now is raging in this country did not begin 2 years ago. It began 20 years ago. Michael Crichton, in his keynote address to AAAS in 1999, warned of it verbatim. He outlined a strategy on how to deal with this coming wave of anti-science. By 2014, I had made 2 movies about the anti-evolution movement and the anti-climate movement. What Al Gore did in his movie was dismiss the whole anti-climate movement, which already was at full boil. And the question is, why didn't that committee in 2014 put together a contingency plan for what to do when this country elects an anti-science president, which is exactly what happened. And there is absolutely no trace of that thought. And I spent years in 2005 and 6 and 7 writing emails to the National Academy of Science and AAAS, asking them, why are you not involved in defending this profession of science? And all I got back was, we don't get involved in politics. So the whole science establishment doesn't think this way. And as a result, they got completely blindsided. And then they turn around and just blame it on the opponents, when the whole patterns were there for decades, literally. So that's
beyond their charge, Randy.
Then whose charge was it?
I think that it was well beyond their charge to do that.
How could they not foresee an anti-science president emerging, given that George Bush in the early 2000s went to warfare with James Hansen over climate? It had already happened with one administration.
Well, I think there has long been a recognition that conservatives are anti-science and, frankly, anti-intellectual.
Yes,
I think there's no doubt. And
okay, so if that's existing, why did they not put together a contingency plan that would have, number one, understood the basic dynamics of communication, the need for a singular voice? And why wasn't there a singular voice ready to oppose Trump as soon as he got up on the stage and began saying cockamamie things on all this?
In bureaucratic structures, people don't do that. You watch Trump urge people to drink the bleach with his science advisors standing next to him going, do we discredit the president right now and lose our jobs? Or can we better serve the public by having some responsible voices continue to be in the room? I think that what you're identifying is a political problem, not a communication problem. It manifested in communication problems. That was my point. But I think the political failure is a different set of issues. And the rise of Trump is part of a toxic media ecology is part of it. Anti-intellectualism, it's populism and
But you're blaming everything on the opponents, and you're not taking a critical eye at all to the behavior of the left and academia and their unwillingness to engage in the real world politics, which is that you've got to somehow come down to the public and have a voice. And you got to have an awareness of this anti-science movement that was growing, for which you're right, that's they don't see that as their purview. And as a result, nobody attended to it. And that's where we ended up where we are now. And by the way, 2 months ago in January, there was a rally for the anti-vaccination crowd. The Washington Post article said this movement that was once fringe lunatics is now tens of millions of Americans, led by Robert Kennedy Jr. And there's no organized opposition to it. And by the way, my friends at NIH told me in January they've been instructed not even to talk about Robert Kennedy Jr., as his book is #1 on Amazon. That is a conspiracy book. It's out of control at this point, and I just don't see how they've been so oblivious.
I don't see how a scientific critique responds to the phenomena that you're describing.
A strategy.
I don't think counterproof means anything to these people. Counter narrative is the only way to.
No, I'm talking about an existing voice of leadership. There was no planning in 2014 of what are we going to do if the voice of leadership suddenly goes off the rails? Where are we going to have an alternate voice established?
I think you're anticipating a phenomena that even people who closely studied politics didn't anticipate.
And that's the problem.
Going into the 2016 election, nobody really predicted that we were going to see Russian intervention the way we did, or that we were going to see Comey open up and investigate the Democratic candidate 7 days before the election. So we had phenomena that were occurring in 2016 that gave us Trump that I don't think people could necessarily have predicted. Now, was there an awareness on the left that anti-science was percolating? Absolutely, especially around issues like climate change. But the assumption that was made was that it was emerging because it was serving the financial interests of some industries, particularly oil and gas.
We're really disagreeing on a lot of these things, because I was in the thick of that. I made a film in 2008 called Sizzle, Global Warming Comedy. I interviewed 6 of the top climate skeptics, and the science world wouldn't even look at it. They didn't want to, their strategy then was don't give them the time of day, don't give them screen time. That's what Al Gore did with his movie. You know, he tried to pretend like there was no anti-climate science movement. And by 2009, with the the Climate Gate event, it showed the muscle of this entire movement that was there. And all they did was put their heads in the sand, I think, because so many of them are so well funded that they just didn't need to attend to this threat. And it's all just blown out of control now. And I don't know what the answers are now, because as I said, tens of millions of anti-vax, which are basically anti-science. And by the way, a lot of the top anti-climate people, namely Mark Morano, the #1 most media exposed climate skeptic, has moved into also the anti-vax movement, trying to merge those together. So it is a mass anti-science movement that is spun out of control now. And still the science world is dominated by this academic thinking of let's just keep the blinders on and pretend like it'll go away on its own. And it's not, I think. But sorry about that.
I don't see the world the way you see it. I think counter narratives will eventually come back. But I think what we're seeing is the fact that the traditional Republican Party constituency has changed. And it has changed in the direction of a populist kind of nativist politics that is knitted together with an anti-science, anti-elitist, anti-wealthy, anti-coastal sort of viewpoint. And I think that's the foundational problem. And it's not going to correct itself until ultimately there's a separation of the sources of big corporate money in the Republican Party from the sources of small donors. And that's why you get people like Mitch McConnell, who, even though he loathes Trump and sees how toxic Trump is for the future of his party, refuses to speak out and try to rein him in because they want those small donors. And it's the big donors that are going to have the say to, I think, break this connection. But we also have decisions about how money flows into politics that are fundamentally corrupt. So you've got all these companies pulling out of Russia, but the Koch brothers are still doing business in Russia. And those are the kinds of issues that are also affecting who speaks up on what topics and with what kind of messages.
Okay, well, let me go back to what we've got here on the screen here, and our listeners, can't see it, but it's what I read there. Again, it was Andy Slavitt saying, think we'll look back, we'll give ourselves an A or an A minus on what we call the hard sciences, and I think we'll give a D minus or an F in the social sciences, meaning communication. This is not some outside pundit or something like that saying that. This is the guy who was on the top of the entire organization there in the White House, assessing his own performance, their own performance. And it's exactly what I felt unraveled all that during that time. I kept asking Osterholm, when are they putting together the equal and opposite communications team to partner with the scientists? They never did. All they ever had was 31 people, 30 of whom were science and doctors and things like that. Only one communications person. Looking at that quote there, what would you offer up for recommendations for getting ready for if there's going to be a next surge?
Well, what we know about messaging is that you've got to have consistency in messaging. It's got to be articulated from the people at the very top. And you've got to have benchmarks that you can talk people through what we call the J curve, when the resistance is at the bottom and people are most unwilling to see things as improving. And the problem with this COVID crisis is that the science was so rapidly changing that people wanted definitive answers at a time when I think the science wasn't yet able to do so. And with each new emergent variant, we've had problems convincing people where we are in the trajectory. So I think the decision last week to communicate to people to put your masks in a drawer, just as this new variant is taking off in Europe, shows the real problem that we face with inconsistent messaging, right? So I think you need metaphors and analogies that make sense. The best one I've seen on the mask is the provision that says the mask isn't going to solve everything, but it's like the raincoat. You wear it when it rains. You wear it when the numbers are going up in your area and the exposure risks are increasing. You put it in your drawer on clear and sunny days when things seem to be improving. But it's not like we're going to just beat this thing. You also need to tell the historical story. The 1918 flu epidemic didn't come and go in a year. It was really a 4 or 5 year phenomena as it hit different parts of the globe at different times. So you use lessons from history to say, we don't know that it will be a perfect match, but this we think is similar to what we may be experiencing here. And of course, what we have in this era is global travel in a way that we never would have imagined it in 1918, right? So an outbreak in Hong Kong is in Los Angeles that afternoon, and that was not the case in 1918. So I think you have to nuance the similarities as well as nuance the difference in your explanation, but you have to be consistent.
Yeah.
You have to have spokespersons who have the respect of the public.
In January of last year of 2021, the pandemic hit its most lethal, spike there with that third surge. And that was the highest mortality going on then. It backed off eventually in February, and by March was clearly, backing way down. Why do you think it backed off in February and March?
Well, two things. People get outside, and so they're less locked in together. We always have flu surges also during winter. And secondly, people started getting vaccines. I got my vaccine January 16th of 2021. And once people started getting vaccinated, it slowed the transmission. And in the summer, it was really pretty well down. But then you get the waning of the immunization protection, and you get people moving back inside. And the new variant, the Delta and then the Omicron variants, and they strike first in the places where people are going back inside. So the upper Midwest and New York and places where it gets cold and it's not comfortable entertaining your friends outside, those are the places that see the uptick first.
Yeah. All right. So, again, I guess this is pretty rude of me to ask you to come have this discussion and disagree with you on things. But Mike Ostrom did an interview with David Leonhardt, the New York Times, last August, I think. And his key word was humility. And he said, we really need to practice humility. There's so much we don't know. And in there, he addressed that thing about why did the spike in January and February go away? And both of those things you said, he addressed. It was still cold in March, so it wasn't like we're out of the winter yet. More importantly, the vaccines didn't begin to get any sort of widespread use until April or so, March or April. That peak went away for reasons that the science community cannot explain to anybody. And that's what he means by humility, is that the science is still at such an elementary level. Everybody feels the need to have clear stories about how it all works. But the truth is, as he says in that interview, we cannot tell you why that giant spike went away. All these spikes come and go like that. And there are people working on curve shapes and trying to explain it in terms of symmetries and things like that. And as Mike says, that's a lot of nonsense. The science is just not up there with explaining some of these dynamics. And, the other one that I find mystifying was in the middle of that whole spike in that third spike, the states of Wisconsin and South Dakota side by side had about the same incidence rates and death rates. One state, Wisconsin, clamped down on everything, social distancing, masking, everything. The other state, South Dakota, did nothing. The two spikes went away at the exact same rate. And so, negating all of these measures being taken. So there's so much mystery like that. And that becomes a communication dynamic, which is the public doesn't want to hear that as an answer. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but there's just so much fundamental science still that is really, it's baffling. And that is the fear coming up this, if it comes back again with another surge. Do you know this expression TLDR?
No.
That's a common thing on websites, things like on Reddit, means too long, didn't read. And so much of what's going on for communication in our society now, especially with younger people, nobody's reading anything, and people are writing all these great treatises and books that they're so proud of. And this is my feeling, is that we've turned into this rapidly, superficially communicating society that I don't know where the knowledge base really exists anymore. It's just so moving along at such a pace. And then this challenge of silos, I'm baffled in my work going back and forth between science and cinema in particular, at the amount of really powerful knowledge that the two sides just can't even begin to tap into because of the divides between silos. Do you spend much time thinking about that in academia, about silos and cross-disciplinary?
Absolutely. Yeah. Especially with regard to, my research area tends to focus on politics. And, it's a product of networked communication, essentially, that people are exchanging information with people who already share their beliefs. They're serving as their own editors of content that they think is important. So they're seeking out information that confirms what they already believe rather than challenges it. They're not willing to expose themselves to information that doesn't appeal to them or doesn't confirm what they already believe. So it's a huge problem.
Huh. Are there programs like at USC that work on trying to get communication across disciplines?
Well, yeah, across disciplines is a somewhat different concept. Absolutely, there's an attempt to work across disciplines in academic communities, but there are also strategies that are designed around trying to engage. For instance, I teach in a journalism school to try to teach journalists to write in such a way to make their work more accessible, interesting, and engaging to people who may not already be informed on the topic or who it may challenge their current and existing beliefs. And so there are strategies in storytelling, for instance, and in the visualization of news and in engaging people in the discovery of their own narrative forms. So yeah, there are attempts to do that. It's a real challenge, though, and the too long did not read part of this is part of the overload of information that we all face, right? There's just more out there than any of us can apprehend, and a lot of what we find seems to be repetitive. And so helping people to figure out what's new and what's novel is one of the challenges to engage them and to amuse them. People are going to seek out information if it does something for them, if it fulfills a need, or if it engages them in some way and amuses them. And so using that as a strategy for your storytelling is the key.
Yeah. Do you, over the years, have you had much collaboration or interaction with folks next door there at the cinema school?
Uh, some, I mean, my son has become a filmmaker, and so through him, his friends, and some of his professors, I've had some collaboration. Um, Sean is interested. My son is interested in all different kinds of cinema, including music videos, and the power of really short music videos to tell more complex stories.
Did he go to the USC film school?
He did, yeah. He graduated in cinema production.
Undergraduate or graduate too?
Undergrad.
Uh-huh. Wow. And so he's out working in the biz now?
He's out in the biz, savage as it may be.
That is great. Have you gotten to know many professors there over the years in cinema?
Yeah, I've gotten to know quite a few, particularly people in the critical studies area, though, more than in the production side.
Yeah, yeah. Did you ever know Drew Casper?
I did, yeah.
He's gone now, isn't he?
Yeah, I don't know what really happened to him, but I know he's gone. We had some joint appointments of cinema faculty in Annenberg too.
Oh yeah.
And so people who are primarily interested in documentary production.
Gotcha. Yeah, I took 3 of his critical studies courses. He was tremendous. He was such an entertaining professor and really made a lot of that stuff so engaging. And what courses do you teach right now?
I'm teaching primarily media and politics and political communication and argumentation courses.
Gotcha. And getting towards the end of this little discussion here, are you optimistic or pessimistic about November and the elections coming up?
I have been pretty pessimistic, but frankly, the unfolding of events in Europe have sort of scrambled everybody's hands. And on the topic of the Ukraine, we're now finding a kind of common agreement with people willing to at least, consider reaching across the aisle that may be helpful. The economy is a real challenge at the moment. Inflation is absolutely a concern for many, many people, and rightly or wrongly, the party in power is going to take the heat for the inflation, even if it's not something that they can easily remedy. The war may have actually given some cover on that too. So, I think it's too early to tell. Political opinion in the US is very evanescent, but we'll see what happens when we get closer. Maybe July and August, we'll have a good handle on where people are.
Yeah, well, $7 a gallon for gas right now is pretty painful, and that's bringing it
Very
home.
painful.
Yeah, awfully quickly. So.
I mean, diesel fuel last week was $6.29 a gallon, and a lot of truckers are on fixed freight contracts, and so one can only feel tremendous empathy for the plight that they're facing.
Yeah. Do you still have a connection back with Minnesota? Is that still your?
I still have family there. Yeah.
Yeah. You go back. That's great. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much for this discussion. And thanks once again for 24 years ago with that great Arouse and Fulfill soundbite. We've gotten a lot of use of that all through the science world. People are constantly, talking about that, using it to structure. I just try and explain to them that even in presentations, individual slides, basically, it's all just comes down to, arousing first before you start pouring the information on people. So such a fundamental principle. And I know you told me back then that it didn't originate with you, but I think you're saying it so eloquently in that one little soundbite. That clip's been shared with lots and lots of professors using their courses in science communication. So, and I wrote about it in all my books. So thank you very much for all of that. And I will continue to stay in touch, and maybe a few years from now, things will even themselves back out in American politics and be at a less stressful time than right now.
It can't get much more stressful, I think.
God, borderline the edge of World War III. You're right. Doesn't get worse than that. So, oh well. Cool. Okay. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you, Randy.
You betcha. Take care.